The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Okay, everyone, thanks for coming. Today's book review is part of several events between Albany and many libraries in our system. It's called Art and Climate Intersections. If you go to artandclimate.net in our newsletter, there's all kinds of events going on at a lot of different libraries that have to deal with climate change and the humanities. So today, we're going to be reading about a book that was just named one of the 10 best books of 2014, The Sixth Extinction. And our speaker, Mary Beth Kolozsvary. Her students call her Dr. K. But you're going to find out it's a small world because the author went around the world interviewing researchers. One chapter takes place in our area. And Mary Beth knows several of the people mentioned in the book that do research on amphibians. So here she is from Siena, Mary Beth Kolozsvary.
Great, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. So yeah, and again, as Joe mentioned, this is part of the Art and Climate Intersections venture, I guess, that the library is participating in. And it's trying to explain or highlight how some of the other disciplines like arts and humanities are trying to bring awareness about the effects of climate change and global warming and climate change to our environment and our natural resources, trying to bring that awareness, understanding so that the non-scientific audience can really understand what is happening, why it's a crisis, and what can be potentially done about it. And that's one of the things and one of the themes in Elizabeth Kolbert's book that she talks about. I wanted to first, I didn't want to make this about me, but I wanted to give a little bit of background on me so that you understand where I'm coming from, my perspective. I'm a assistant professor of environmental studies and sciences right down the road at Siena College. I've been there for about 4 years. Prior to that, I was at the New York State Museum, the New York State Biodiversity Research Institute for about 6 or 7 years. And when I was there, I worked alongside museum scientists and a lot of regional, statewide conservation groups, and where I was involved in grant funding to identify important needs for biodiversity research in New York State, so that we could increase our understanding and awareness, figure out what we could do to help preserve biodiversity. And I also worked a lot with educational, public outreach and education type ventures as well. So as a scientist, I'm used to communicating my research to other scientists, and so being able to try to understand how to communicate the importance or significance of the research and why it's important and why we need to do something is definitely something that I've struggled with and worked with over the years. And one thing that I really liked about Elizabeth's book is that she's coming from this whole picture and this whole perspective as a non-scientist. And so she's able to kind of put these important scientific concepts and these concerns, at least from my perspective, in a way that non-scientists can understand and hopefully appreciate. So it was a great opportunity. So thanks again for having me come and read this book and give a review of my perspectives on this book. Before we get started, I just kind of want to poll, how many of you have read the book or read parts of the book? All right, excellent. So great. So just kind of having an idea. That's why I asked Joe. Is he said that some people have probably read the book, but the audience is wide and they just want to hear about what the book's about and your opinions on it. So Elizabeth Kolbert, just a little bit on the background on the author. She is a staff writer on the New Yorker. She is not a scientist. She is a scientific writer, though. She's a journalist. She writes articles. She's authored books in the past. Her more recent book was Field Notes from a Catastrophe, again, about environmental, natural resource issues. That book was about climate change, global climate change, what's causing global climate change, what are some of the current concerns, and what are some of the implications. She is from this area. She's from the Berkshires, so right across the border. Some of the examples, at least in this book, The Sixth Extinction, are, as Joe pointed out, are local examples. So it's again a way for people like myself that have grown up in this region in the Northeast to really understand and relate and connect to it. How she does her work, again, she's not a scientist, but what she does is she does the library research, she gets scientific articles, reads up on the subjects before she ventures into writing these, but she also talks to the scientists. And so she'll interview, she'll call them, she'll ask them, questions and to try to get a better understanding, and she gets to go out in the field with them. So she actually goes out and sees these areas and sees the scientists at their work, at their research, and they show her, what they're finding out, the significance of what they're doing, and then she is able to put all that from her perspective. What her experiences were, and they translate it. It makes it such a really engaging, I think, read. It's a way. It's really kind of almost like next best thing to being there, watching her, listening to her as she explored these issues and talked to these people from her perspective. And it's weird because as much as I've worked over the years and try to convey my research to the non-scientific public, I can't escape the fact that I am a scientist. I'm a trained scientist. I've worked with scientists. That's the way I think, and it's often very difficult to totally put yourself in somebody else's shoes. So that's why it's so great to see people working with different disciplines to try to address some of these issues and communicate the importance. And before I go on, I'll mention again about how I'm in the Environmental Studies and Sciences department at Siena College. And that's a very important field because, and in particular with Siena being a liberal arts college no matter what, we train our students so they get a variety of different experiences, whether they're a science major, a humanities major, a business major. They're required to take courses in all the different various disciplines. And hopefully that, the idea behind that is so they get a more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary type perspective on whatever they venture out to do. I teach classes like environmental science and a conservation biology class, and that's an upper level class that deals with a lot of these types of issues, what people are doing out there about this extinction crisis and how we can potentially solve these problems. But I also teach ecology to non-majors. And so I'm often trying to look for a lot of different ways and adopt a lot of different forums and media to try to get at students. And so I often have them read books and text and more popular press articles to try to understand and relate some of the issues. So I definitely appreciate the importance and the ability of that. So no matter what the career path of these students are, I think it's important to have that interdisciplinary perspective because we need to be able to communicate and understand to be able to solve some of these problems. So that's a little bit about me. That's a bit about her, in terms of her being a scientific writer, but not a scientist. And this book, The Sixth Extinction, it's a really peppy title. It's discussing this current extinction event that we're going on that many people don't even realize that we're in the process of going under right now. And before she launches into talking about detailing and explaining how that's happening and why it's happening, she uses the first several chapters to describe past extinction events that have happened in the geologic history and explained what the causes were or what we believe the causes were of those extinction events and what were the implications of those catastrophic, very large events on the life and the natural world around us. And then she uses the rest of the book to try to give examples of some extinction events that are currently are happening right now in front of our very eyes. And one of the important things about this book and what she's highlighting is that the sixth extinction, what's happening right now, is human caused. The previous extinction events were not human caused. There was a variety of different causes that happened that created those extinction events, and they were very catastrophic. But this extinction event is because of humans. It's because of our direct actions, not necessarily intentionally, our direct and indirect actions and the implications of our actions, and what's happening to our natural world around us. And another thing that's really important is, I think this book highlights things that I picked up on, is it's really hard for people to accept this. They can read about the extinction crisis, they can say, oh, we lost a species, but it's really hard for them to really grasp and understand and feel charged that they really need to do something. And I think this book being targeted to a non-science audience and trying to be able to put into perspective and some of those themes, I think is very important to hopefully help change the mindset, because we really do need to change the mindset, because we can't continue on that same trajectory of putting blinders on and being very short-sighted. So the book talks first about the previous 5 mass extinctions before it launches into the current context. But before she talks about that, the first chapter she talks about is titled "The Sixth Extinction," and that highlights something that's going on right now. It's kind of the introduction to the book, and it's talking about a group of organisms that's very near and dear to me: amphibians. I didn't mention it earlier, but one of my research specialties, I'm an ecologist, and I've specialized in amphibians, and particularly pool breeding amphibians in this area. So as Joe pointed out, I actually know a lot of the people. I've interacted with them at meetings. I've gone to talks. I've talked to them before. So it was really cool. So I have a different perspective when I read this book. As a scientist, I'm engaged, and I'm very interested in the history behind that she highlights in this book. So amphibians, they've been around for 250 million years. There's thousands of species that are present. And I guess just if you sit and think about it, they've been a group that have been around for 250 million years. And they've been quite successful. And for them to have been able to, if you think about all the environmental changes that have happened throughout that course of time, you think about, well, this group of species has been successful. They've been able to deal with temperature changes and habitat changes and species dying out, et cetera, and they've been successful. So to see that first chapter where she talks particularly about the tropics, about the Panamanian golden frog and the decimation of that population. They're now in captivity, the only remaining individuals. It's all, they've basically died out from areas where they used to be extremely abundant. And it's really amazing to hear and to really wrap your head around the fact that there used to be, hundreds of species, different individuals. You'd walk into an area, and then within a matter of a couple years, they've vanished from the area, basically. And so that was very engaging. It was very interesting to me. This is a species that, you think about a frog, but they're very abundant in the tropics, very high population size, very high numbers of species. But some species have actually even been able to, the wood frog, for example, can colonize the Arctic Circle. They're able to withstand those cold temperatures like outside by basically being able to freeze in the winter. They have a variety of mechanisms to be able to do that. So these species, this group of organisms is under threat as a result of human-caused actions. And so that chapter talks about, particularly in the tropics, the Panamanian golden frog and a variety of other frog species in the tropics. And the cause of the extinction that they found are the eliminations of these species, population drops, etc., is a result of what we call a chytrid fungus. It was a newly discovered fungus. Actually, when I was in graduate school at the University of Maine, when this kind of started hitting the news, when they were started to discover these dying frogs in the tropics as a result of this fungus, the woman that first described the chytrid fungus was actually at the University of Maine at that time. So she was very much involved in the work and the early research with this fungus. And you might wonder, the species or this group of organisms that's been able to deal with changes in species compositions and temperature and habitats, and they've been able to withstand that over 250 million years, to all of a sudden be dropping basically out of the sky, dropping out like flies, just, where they were deafening, you hear nothing now. It's like silent. And to have that happen, you wonder, well, how could that happen? How could a fungus come in and create that devastation? And they've basically tried it. There's a couple of hypotheses how that fungus got introduced into the area. But no matter what is the cause and how it got there, it is a result of human movements. Humans introducing in one way or another, a wave form and another, bringing and somehow transporting that fungus to that area. And normally, under regular conditions, under normal conditions, when you see slight changes in the environment, species are able to adapt. Some organisms have a resistance to the fungus or develop a resistance to fungus, and they're able to evolve together so that they basically can persist or generally persist or have a greater capacity to persist in an environment. But in this case, the introduction was so sudden, and then the fact that these species weren't equipped to deal with that. It was it was not native to the area. This non-native, basically invasive fungus came into an area, and the frogs weren't equipped to be able to deal with it. So their numbers have been dropping. The book also talks about, it interviews some of the researchers that were there initially when they discovered the fungus and they discovered the dying frogs, and she also talks about some of the efforts they're trying to do to actually try to preserve some of the species. They go out there and they kind of get ahead of where the fungus has moved to, and they collect the frogs and they put them in these little aquariums, and they put these in these little zoos inside, and everybody has to wear these suits to try to not to spread disease from one frog to another, because they want to keep them alive, and they try to learn how to breed them in captivity. And this is basically what they're trying to do, and they're trying to keep them alive, and with the hopes that one day they'll be able to figure out how to reintroduce them into these areas where chytrid fungus is present. But the chytrid fungus is really successful. We're not really sure what the future holds, but it definitely introduces the whole book. It's something that's happening right now. It's something that's human caused. It's a result of humans and spreading invasive species, not intentionally, but spreading it into an area, and then having a group of species such as amphibians, and in particular in this case frogs, not being able to deal with it, and then species becoming extinct as a result of it. And this is not over. That's a continuing story. The next few chapters that she talks about, again, it's an introduction into introducing some of the past extinction events that happened. And in the next chapter, she talks about the mastodon's molars. And one thing that I was very interested in about was really understanding about, and I like the fact that it brought into the history of it, is that scientists, as open-minded as we are supposed to be, and be able to entertain new ideas, new theories, and if there's evidence, to accept them, we're human. We try to be as unbiased as possible, but we're human too. And so prior conceptions and prior thoughts and understandings and what was generally accepted sometimes hinder our ability to look forward and be proactive in the future. So, for example, the mastodons molars, they talk about how she introduces about how prior to the 1700s, people didn't really understand what extinction was. It wasn't a concept that they had in mind at all. Zoologist Linnaeus had developed a classification system of the variety of different life, and they grouped similar species together and trying to put order and understanding and trying to understand the natural world. But nobody really ever conceived of the idea that there used to be a whole different world in the past where that had different species, that was totally different environment. They had no concept or understanding or appreciation of that. And so that is another thing that I thought was really interesting about this book. And from a scientific perspective, somebody that's worked in natural history for this many years, I definitely found that very interesting and engaging. And I certainly learned a lot as I was reading through this book. And it really made me think about the fact is that hinders us. How we all try to put order and understanding so that we can understand an issue, understand how the world works, but that can kind of hinder us from moving forward. So it was interesting, very interesting that all these bones were being dug up and fossils, and people were saying that these mastodons and mammoths were elephants, and they had them misclassified, and it was years and decades before finally Cuvier started looking at these bones and saying, this is not an elephant. And he actually was able to, by bucking the trend and taking that other view and throwing past history and past understanding out the door, he was able to advance us quite a bit in terms of our understanding that and acceptance that there used to be a variety of different organisms in the past that don't exist today. And so that was very interesting, and he was one of the first people because he identified that these organisms used to exist. He also identified that he speculated that it was a catastrophic events that eliminated those species. He didn't say why, didn't speculate, didn't really know why, but he brought that into the mix. And the next few chapters kind of talk about that, and that's one thing that, from a scientific view, I really liked reading about how the different scientists and their different egos and how they fought with each other and were reluctant to take these big steps forward in terms of our thinking. And I think that is another message in the book as to why people today, and why, although there's a sixth extinction happening in front of us and there's evidence to the effect it's human caused, why we're not really doing anything about it. I think it's got a lot to do with previous mindset and our inability to accept and maybe accept responsibility. I'm not really sure. So the next few chapters, they talk about that. They talk about the different mass extinction events in the past and the effects of that. And some of these mass extinction events, again, were from different causes. Some were from glacial changes in the atmosphere, cooling of the Earth's surface, advancement of glaciers, and really talked about eliminations of species, whole different types of communities and systems. And what was really interesting is that in so many of these examples, were where there were species that were so adapted to the current conditions, so prolific, were basically the dominant species, to all of a sudden, because of these changing conditions, not be able to adapt anymore, not being fitted for these new environments. Extinction was a reality for that, and And as a result of that, and then not being able to adapt or change to those conditions, our whole trajectory of evolution and what the world looked like in the future changed as a result of it, because the species composition changed. She highlights a couple other things, especially historically, and I think a lot of that, like I think in the 3rd chapter, they talk about the great auk, and it brings into the understanding that over-exploitation by humans in the past, as well as currently right now, are one of the big threats and one of the big causes, main causes for the 6th extinction that is going on today. And so she gives examples from the past in terms of when early settlers to areas, or folks moving around, voyagers, adventurers moving around on ships from place to place, would come upon an island where species, and like the great auk, for example, were flightless. They had no defense against predators. They're not used to predators. People were able to easily capture these animals, use these animals, and they never really thought about the fact is that, I'm basically wiping these species out. They didn't think about it. They would fill up their barrels with the meat so that they could go on. And it was interesting that it's depressing, but it's also interesting to think about, what the mindset of and the understanding of the people at that time is when they moved into an area. They didn't really think about the implications. They didn't think about extinction. They didn't really think that anything other than this was a food source and it was available to them, and it was easy to get, and they moved on. So it's interesting. So it's something that in the past, I don't believe any other species out there has been as successful as humans are at being able to over-exploit and manipulate our environment. And one is directly through, over-exploitation of species. So the first few chapters, she talks about the previous extinction events. Again, the most recent one was with when the dinosaurs were eliminated. Again, that was a result of an asteroid impact to the Earth, and it wasn't just the impact of the asteroid itself, but then it was all the dust that got spread out across the world as a result of it, and all the impacts in terms of what the changes are. If that chance collision hadn't happened, the world would be a very different place. We wouldn't be here today. It would be a very different place. And it's so interesting to see and understand how these different causes for these mass extinctions happened, but none of those were human caused. Towards the latter part of the book, and probably the majority of the book, she talks about, again, human impact on the environment and species, and how we're causing these extinctions. Again, weaves in examples of how burning of fossil fuels, which are key players in this, burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, removing of habitat, how that's changing our atmosphere, increasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and so now we're having warmer temperatures despite the temperature today. Overall, it's warming, things are changing. She gives a lot of examples, which I thought was really interesting, going down to the tropics, showing examples how we often think about the Arctic Circle and more northern environments are the ones that are going to be hit the hardest. But she also shows where she's gone out into the tropical rainforest, where these are very species-rich types of environments, and where there's a variety of different species, and it shows how over a very short distance, a very short walk, the entire species composition can change, or maybe not the entire species composition, but the forest composition can change over a very small stretch. And so it's a lot of these tropical species in these very species-rich environments have very narrow ranges where they specialize and do so well. So again, she'll show examples of that, and show how that, again, how these areas are very threatened because it's not necessary. Some species are better at dispersing or moving from one area to another as conditions change. But a lot of them, so for example, the frog, aren't necessarily that equipped to move or change and adjust to these conditions. So we're potentially losing a lot of species that way. Again, tropical rainforests, even that. She talks about the oceans. So the ocean environment, with the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, thus the warming of the temperature, warming of the ocean temperatures and the implications of that. With more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it actually diffuses into the ocean environment. And so a lot of our carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the ocean. So at first thought, you might think that's not necessarily a big deal, not an important thing, and it's great that it's taking up the carbon dioxide, so it's not warming up so rapidly. But there's a lot of implications to the ocean systems as a result of it. Many of the organisms, and she shows past examples of where organisms have been eliminated from areas and where they're being eliminated right now. As a result of this increase, because when the carbon dioxide moves into the ocean, it becomes carbonic acid and less calcium carbonates available for many of these organisms that need that for their exoskeletons. So as a result of the increase in as well as the increase in temperature as well, and the CO2 into the oceans, we're changing those environments. And she shows numerous examples, which is really interesting and a really great read to be able to see that. She talks about coral reefs and going out to the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia, and showing how, and talking about different examples about how this species-rich environment that's taken years and years to build up is slowly being eroded away. And this tropical rainforests and terrestrial environments and coral reefs and oceanic environments, those are two very species-rich communities, and they're areas where numerous species use for food, for shelter, depend and rely on those, not to mention all the other important features that the coral reefs, for example, impart to humans. So as a result of that, human-caused, not intentionally, but indirectly and unintentionally, effects on it are affecting the coral reefs, eliminating species, and it's going to be, in the very near future. So she highlights that in some of the examples. I'm trying to think of what some of the other examples were. Again, she also talks about, the changing the cycles in terms of the carbon cycle, global cycles, nitrogen, phosphorus, changing our whole environments as a result of our using of the landscape. Whether it's direct over exploitation of species or affecting their habitats. She also talks about our constructions of roads and cutting down, removing forests and habitat from species, so eliminating some species, or many of the species are just in zoos right now where they're trying to do captive breeding projects, but it's just definitely a fight. And she tries to explain that and relate that back to historic events where, none of those were human caused. This is human caused. So I thought those were really great examples. And she also talks about how invasive species, again, how I talked about that chytrid fungus being introduced into the tropics, wiping out many species of the frogs. Again, as Joe mentioned in the beginning of the talk, about how one of the examples that she talks about in the book are how the white nose syndrome with the bats that are affecting North American bats. Again, that's another example of invasive species that were introduced to our area. Our claim to fame is the introduction of the white nose syndrome to bats in this area. I believe that the first case that they've documented or evidence of it being introduced to the area was seen. It was in Howe's Cave, so just west of here, a very popular tourist destination that many of us have been to. And then you could see the progression of the disease, where these overwintering bats were just dropping from the bat roosts. As a result of that, so year after year, there's basically a concentric circle coming right outside of Albany, New York, or right around here, as it's been expanding, and it's been decimating a number of our bats. Last year when I taught conservation biology, I had one of the bat folks from DEC come and talk to our class about what they've been finding. And some colonies that back when I used to work for DEC, this was a while ago, I used to go on some of those bat surveys and go to where they overwinter in caves, and you count the bats. And basically where there were thousands and thousands of bats, you can, and it would take a whole day and a team full of people. Now it takes, 20 minutes and 3 people or something to actually cover an area. So it's, and you think about how the implications of that are going to be in terms of the role of them in these systems, in these ecosystems. And although we've fragmented habitats and isolated areas where many of the species occur, we're now, because we're so mobile, we're moving things around. So we're moving the chytrid fungus around. We've brought the white nose syndrome from Europe, where it wasn't decimating bats because the bats there naturally co-occurred and evolved with them. Coming here, a novel new disease being introduced, basically wiping out those species. So, or having a tremendous impact. So we're, again, unintentionally, because of our actions, not thinking about what the implications of the actions are and having these tremendous effects as a result of it. So again, the book, it highlights a variety of different causes, relates the historical context, as well as giving current examples of what's happening now in front of us. And then, so the last chapter, she talks about how, basically how our direct and indirect actions are causing this extinction, destroying of habitat, removing habitat, without really thinking, and we're very short-sighted. We're not thinking long-term. We're thinking about, well, I'm not going to think about 20 years from now or 50 years from now. I'm worrying about today. Well, we rely on these species, we rely on these systems for clean water, for the clean air that we breathe, and we rely on these, and we're responsible for this. And so, I'm not really sure if she ended the book on a positive note. I don't really think there was a positive, the sixth extinction, it kind of says it all. But what I do think it is positive because it gets us thinking. And it gets us thinking about how, looking in the back and how ignorance kind of prevented us from moving forward very fast in terms of the scientific community, in terms of understanding and appreciating, even accepting that extinctions happen, or accepting why they happen. That was our ignorance, our having blinders on, and our inability to really see the big picture. So I thought that it really highlighted that. It highlighted how much we are causing this extinction. I love the way that she wrote the book, and at least was able to connect with the researchers, and I really like the way she put it into, I think, terms that people can understand, and stories. Sometimes, like when I give lectures, I try to when I teach, I try to give a variety of different, I get guest lectures in, I have them use a variety of different media to try to get messages apart and actually learn it. because just me talking isn't gonna necessarily do it. And I think that her being able to talk about her adventures, now it's not like we're on these adventures, but it kind of is. It's coming from her perspective. I think it's definitely very helpful in terms of I think the non-scientific audience to be able to maybe grasp it a little bit more and maybe take a little bit more responsibility. And I think that is the whole point of this series too. That this new book review is a part of as well, is trying to get this whole awareness out in terms of understanding what the problem is, what's causing it, really getting it, and really understanding what the implications are for the future. Last year, I'm a member of a organization, Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences. It's a national organization of basically faculty and researchers and conservationists that work in environmental studies and work in the environmental field. And our last year's conference was in New York City, and it was Welcome to the Anthropocene. And so I thought that was, very fitting. And actually, now that I look back, it was possibly as a result of the book and one of the chapters that she had. But it really dealt with trying to deal with this environmental crisis that we have right now. And it's not just going to be it's not just in the hands of the scientists. It's the hands of the policymakers. It's the hands of everyone. And it's a responsibility for everyone to try to take that time to become a little bit more aware of what's going on, why it's going on, and what the implications are. So hopefully, and you're only going to be able to do it, I think, by changing the whole mindset of humans overall. So, on that note, if anybody you have a question?
So she talked about the Denovians, the ones that have the Denovians, the Homo sapiens.
Okay, she didn't go into too much detail, but like right before that, but she did talk about that in the chapter right before the last chapter talked about it. I just didn't want to kind of go into it, but okay. About how that if Homo sapiens hadn't been around, there is a real likelihood that Neanderthal would still be coexisting today with their environment. They just didn't as closely related as, capable of interbreeding, so closely related, but they just had different behaviors, and I guess I'm not really sure exactly.
One more. Does the book talk at all about the role of religion in terms of getting in the way of the understanding of science, the advancement of science? It's interfering now with denying climate deniers, for example.
No, not at all, actually.
So religion gets off scot-free in the book.
It does, because there's a lot of other ignorance that apparently. Yeah, no. I'm just trying to think. Maybe no. It didn't even really talk about that in terms of the history, in terms of science. Yeah. So no, it really didn't go into it. But that was another good, at least from my perspective, in terms of how she presented things. That she tried to put it in. It's as unbiased as possible in terms of not really trying to push a certain agenda. That was my impression.
An agenda? Pose that as a question rhetorical.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good.
Since our world is the beneficiary, or exists, notwithstanding that there are 5 previous extinctions to this one, is she suggesting that if there is this, assuming the worst, there is this 6th extinction, is she suggesting that the mechanisms that caused the regeneration of life after the last 5 extinctions will not operate, or that there will not be a generation, if you will, after the 6th extinction?
She doesn't really get into that. I just think that it's a very different extinction. It's an extinction event that we are causing, and we could very likely be one of the extinct species as a result of it. Those past extinction events, there were species that were able to hold on after them. So it just basically, the ones that were able to withstand whatever the particular cause of it was, as a result of that, they basically shaped the future, the ones that were able to hold on. So she doesn't really go into that in terms of like wiping out, all life. It's just the fact that
Life will be different following the...
extremely different, and I don't know that.
Just as life today is just very different from when the dinosaurs lived prior to the fifth extinction.
And I don't know that anybody's even speculating on what it would be like, because we're still trying to understand what the changes are. There are speculations in terms of global temperature changes, in terms of what species distributions could look like under different climate change scenarios. So that we're doing, but that's still...
You see, one of the great achievements of the Darwinian revolution was that it knocked human beings out of the privileged position that it occupied in former way conceptions of life, that human beings were at the pinnacle of creation. Now we're going through a sixth extinction, and with Darwin we know that there's nothing privileged about us as opposed to anything else, any other life. So is there anything that privileges life as it exists today versus life as it may come to be after the sixth extinction?
What do you mean privileges?
In other words, it's privileges, meaning that we should, that from a purely scientific point of view, scientists don't privilege individual species, right? We're just part of life. We privilege ourselves and we privilege the world we live in because we're human beings. But that's not necessarily a scientific view. That's a human
survival view.
Survival, human. But from a purely scientific standpoint, we're just one of a number of species. All the species that exist today are just one of innumerable species that have been part of the march of life since life began, millions, billions of years ago. So there's nothing in scientists say that privileges our current level of existence as opposed to whatever level of existence, kind of life, etc., that may arise after the sixth extinction.
I didn't hear anything about like a keystone creature or whether the author is looking at it more like as you take more creatures out and the system gets kind of threadbare, does it break down, or is there some kind of an idea of how we need this diversity and how it works together?
Yes, doesn't go into as detailed as I think it could, but I think the length of the book and the size of the book and trying to get into too much. So she treats some of those topics not as in depth as a book that would go more into that, but she does talk about that. I can't remember which chapter where they talk about the different interconnections and how species depend on each other in terms of these ecosystems that have evolved over time, how there's this interconnected network. And, sometimes you can lose a species from a particular area and things go okay because another species can hide in there. But if you have too much of that or crucial or critical species, things collapse. She doesn't really go into that at all, I would have to say, not much at all. I think she was dealing with, I don't know. I think maybe focusing more on extinctions and trying to tell it through relating to these stories with the scientists and things. I think that was kind of the emphasis. Go ahead.
Is there a bibliography for further reading on some of these?
Yeah.
About 50 pages.
I'm not sure, but yeah. Yeah, so each of the chapters, she's got different bibliography in terms of that, as well as an overall, I think. So, yeah. Yep.
Today's Times Union has an article by George Wills regarding the topic of climate change and so forth, catastrophes that have occurred just the last few hundred years.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, and when I read his column, I have to have a dictionary next. But also last evening on PBS, the Nature program had a program concerning fauna in France, and a statement was made how two of the species were almost eliminated through natural causes. And one of the natural causes, another predators such as human beings shooting down birds and so forth. But the statement ended with saying that these two species were recovering due to the actions of the government. They realized what a resource it was to their culture and their country.
Yeah. Yep.
That's all.
Yeah, and it can take a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort to try to save some of those species. We've definitely got some examples. I'm trying to remember if it was in this book or someplace else I was reading recently, showing some examples of how much time and effort it goes into doing that. But yes, and realizing it, and realizing that it's important, that those species are important. Were you going to say something?
Well, I kind of had two questions. One was whether she talks about the deniers, like deniers of global warming at all, and how to sort of deal with that. And the other thing I was wondering about, like the implications of some of these, losing some of these species. For example, you talked about the particular frog in the rainforest. I mean, most of us, certainly I have never been in tropical rainforest. I've certainly been to museums or places, natural history, where I'm aware of other species that I don't see. But I'm curious, does she talk about the implications of the, loss of some of these species?
Yeah, she does. It and I'd have to say I don't know that it's exhaustive. So, and I think that's one of the things you can't do everything with it. So like this book, and I think the way she approached it is kind of one stepping stone and one way to approach talking about and introducing the topic and being able to get an understanding. And I think you get a lot of the understanding through her examples of her, of her interactions with the scientists and coming from her perspective and what she saw. So although you haven't been to the tropical rainforest, you kind of get some of those pictures through reading and kind of understanding our coral reefs or seeing what happens along this gradient of ocean acidification and what can happen to species. You kind of get that. So I think that's kind of her approach to it instead of really delving really deep into that particular topic. She doesn't talk about climate change deniers. There really are still around. Yes. So that talked more about the climate change and understanding of that. But this one didn't really talk about people denying extinction or just the historical context. That was enough. That was very interesting. Scientist deniers, that very much so. In fact, they were the most vehement deniers. Go ahead, and then I'll get you.
Does she mention the bees?
Oh, my question.
Does not mention the bees.
That's a big one.
It is. Yeah. No, definitely, she doesn't. There's no shortage of examples, is there? We can't even get them all in there. What were you going to say?
I'm a very practical person, and obviously I have realized I'm not scientific at all, but I have realized that there are lots of problems with our environment, many. What was your advice, or maybe even from reading her book, what is your advice for the average person as far as taking actions. Obviously, saving water, trying to, do all the things that we've been encouraged to do so that we're not selfish about how we live our lives. That's what I think people don't get. Because there are so many people, especially the younger generations, who simply live their lives as if none of this were happening around them. And it can be very disturbing that people don't get how they need to take care of the environment. And what you've presented is a very scientific approach about the extinctions and how important that is. But that's so far from where I think the average person is today in our society. At least that's what it seems like from my perspective. Because I can't even get my family interested in, environmental things and trying to be at least conscious about it. And they're not uneducated people. They just, and I guess it's because people have so many problems, just survival, and you did mention that. That's why people cut down trees. That's why they, killed animals for their own survival. And it's because we are so selfish as a species. Or we certainly don't think about anybody else but ourselves.
Yeah, we're worrying about whether the heat's working.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the thermostat. How come it's not going over whatever, Yeah. So now I got to deal with that, yeah.
So an approach to trying to educate the masses.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, I don't have the answer for that, really. I think it comes down to the being able to connect with it. How else do you change mindset?
And that seems to be what you hope to do with your students.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that this book, then you have to have the people that'll probably pick it up and read it are possibly the ones that are already connecting. Go ahead. So unfortunately, I don't, other than I try to raise awareness, and I think that's part of one of the issues with this whole series, that the joint venture, the art and humanities venture of trying to raise awareness of it is figuring out ways that other people that aren't educated or aren't aware of it already to connect with it. That's going to be a big thing, and how do you get it? Other than, you're right, catching, in terms of catching them young, because they're the ones that are inheriting the earth from us, and they're just going to be, I just think about it, how it was 20 years ago versus right now, just some of the changes that I've seen, and you just think about what's it going to be like in another 20, very different. So I think that connection is very important, and getting to a variety of, to a variety of different people. And I try to do that with my students. My students are very passionate, luckily, and have energy, and we try to instill that in them. And but it's and I think this is a good step, though. Having people like, not me, I'm a scientist, and no matter how good I could be at trying to put together something and explain something to a non-scientific audience, I am a scientist. So I think the interdisciplinary, hitting people that come from a variety of different backgrounds, the business folks, just anybody that has total different perspective, total different mindsets and mind thinking, you need to get them on board and get them to, at least some of those individuals, those key individuals, to get and understand and appreciate it and understand the severity of the issue, in order to help be able to communicate to people that think differently from us. Because how do you change the mindset of the way people think? I don't know. Go ahead. Yeah, no, you guys brought up some great points too, and examples of how it's not just one thing. There's a lot of different ways. So, thanks. Thank you. guys.